Hello, everybody, and welcome to our second of our community meetings on DefCore for September. The purpose of this meeting is to drill into the designated sections discussion, but we can certainly be a little bit broader. The agenda is to spend 15 minutes going through the DefCore status and history. I'm sorry, I'll be sort of in lecture mode because I'm trying to give us the background really quickly, but we'll stop at the end of that, take questions and do discussions as necessary, and then spend the remainder of the time, and I do want to keep us as much as possible to the strict hour boundary, talking about the topic at hand, which is designated sections, and I'll explain how all those things fit together. But our goal is not to necessarily reopen questions for DefCore in process. We certainly can if there's a need, but to focus in on the specific question that's being asked, which is about designated sections. And I'll explain how all that fits together in the next couple minutes. Any concerns about the agenda or the topics before we get started?
No.
And I know Sean is here too, so I'm assuming. Sean, can you throw your name in the meeting agenda list under meeting?
Yep. Doing it now.
Okay, so DefCore. DefCore is a subcommittee of the board whose purpose is to define what constitutes the commercial core for OpenStack use of the trademark. We do that by defining capabilities. Capabilities are broad group of functionalities within the projects. Designated code, which is required code that needs to be included by vendors to use the OpenStack trademark. And then those are bundled together effectively as a set of must-pass tests. So we use the capabilities to inform which tests a vendor their products must pass before they can use the OpenStack trademark. And we use Tempest. We could be broader today. We're using Tempest as the benchmark. So it's community resource driven to define the tests and the capabilities. And the overall goal is interoperability based on a set of minimum standards. So when people look at core, the goal has been and is consistently driven from the board's perspective as the smallest set that we can have, and then expand it to be larger. And it's important to note there's a whole bunch of details with this. I've written the effect of a book through a whole series of blog posts, and I'll point out a couple of those where we talk about the balance of stability and features and innovation, but it's important to understand the integrated release, which is managed by the TC, and bringing new projects in through an incubation process into that integrated release. Core is a subset of those. And it's an ongoing process. I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. The thing that trips people up sometimes, though, is when we talk about DefCore, we're talking about commercial use. We're not talking about the technical decisions and the integrated release. Those are the body of code. We're really talking about how OpenStack brand is used by vendors in an approved way. This started from, it's been a long-running process. We've been working on this for well over 2 years. In Hong Kong, the board approved these guiding principles. The guiding principles walk through a couple of major topics. Starting from we're first working on a definition of core that applies to all uses of OpenStack, public, private, banana factories, whoever wants to use OpenStack, we're defining core for them first. We have taken a rather rigorous approach in that there are lots of questions like specialized marks for OpenStack that we are deferring to the future. Those conversations are much harder to have until we've established the minimum core, and then we will look at potentials for having a private cloud or a public cloud core and things like that, or a left-handed core and a right-handed core. The next section of these principles are that we have a set of required code. So the core process is intended to not be an API-only specification, but be a code plus API specification. So that and this is really what drives today's conversation, this concept of designated code. Projects are expected to have a reference implementation, and vendors can substitute that reference implementation with other components. So we have sort of these required pieces that are designated, that's what we call designated, and then allowable substitutions. From that, we then apply the tests. Whether a vendor substitutes the code or not, they're still expected to pass the tests that are required to be passed, and so we have a whole test selection process that has really evolved into a capabilities selection process. And so the first part of our time in DefCore was really spent figuring out how you would choose which tests were required, so sort of working that principle circle backwards. And figuring out what tests would be required meant grouping them into capabilities. Once they were grouped into capabilities, we had to have a way to pick which capabilities were considered required in core or not. We did that using a principles-based approach, so we defined 12 principles. We'd actually defined more, and we settled down to these 12. Those 12 break into 4 major buckets about usage, technical direction, playing well with others, and taking a system view. So right now we balance all 12 criteria against in these 4 major categories. We have scored. This was a major activity leading up to the Atlanta summit, actually to our OSCON meeting, was actually using these criteria to score the capabilities. This is the list of capabilities for Havana. It's important to note that we are working against Havana. Havana will be an advisory, so we want the community, vendors in the community, to take our results, apply them to their Havana products, understand that it won't be enforced as a requirement, but they can start preparing for this in Icehouse and Juneau. And so when we talk about Havana, the idea here is to give people very concrete answers and see the impacts of decisions, and yet not yet make it a license consequence. The Havana information will effectively be used to bootstrap the Icehouse process and the Juneau process, and we have one of these documents. Here it is. We have a DefCore process document that shows how we expect this to go on a release-by-release cycle. So you start with the last release, and then feed it into the system. I could spend a whole hour just talking about this process chart. The short answer of it is that there will be a capabilities file. There already is one. It's in JSON. We're working on a designated sections JSON file, both of which go under Garrett review, so we can collect community feedback. And those ultimately, through that process, end up being voted on by the board as a accepted artifact. And then the yellow indicates community input. We're very focused on getting data-driven input, and there's a project called RefStack designed to collect Tempest results and compare them. We're actually right now at this community input phase where we're trying to get community feedback about the designated sections for this. We've also been getting community feedback about core capabilities. Those things are now moving towards board approval next Thursday. The board has already acted on these capabilities, and so what you'll see is the ones in green, 75 and above, were identified as Havana core capabilities. A significant number of them, 5 of them, including both of the Swift capabilities, were right on the edge, and so there is some play or argument going that some of the ones that are on the edge should be reconsidered as being not in Havana core capabilities. That's the type of dialogue that we want to have. It's a normal part of the process. So what our experience has been is that while we're talking about principles and guidance and criteria, they're very fuzzy. Actually presenting people with a list of capabilities that are in or not in really crystallizes the discussion so that people understand the impacts. And then we use the principles to make sure that when we have issues or contention, which we're an open community, of course we do, that we have a way to go back to our principles and guide those. So the next, okay, I had a picture in here that I want to talk through. Sorry, I'm hunting for a picture. There it is. I use my blog and posts on my blog as a way to get information out early before some of this becomes official. So if you have questions or want to review, there's quite a bit of information here. And I'm always happy to entertain group or one-on-one discussions about these items. This picture is designed to show the relationship with API and capabilities and designated sections. So the idea here is that as we're picking from the whole integrated release, there are certain capabilities per project that have been selected as core or not core. So not all the capabilities of a project, but a subset based on the criteria. And then within an individual project, there are components that are designated or not designated to varying degrees. It's also possible for projects to have no required capabilities, no core capabilities. And in those cases, the designated sections, it's still desirable to have them because they tell vendors what, where to upstream and what parts of the code are stable and long-term maintained, and where they can make alterations and substitutions. However, if you don't have a required capability, there's really no point in having, there's no enforcement for designated sections. So if, for example, Keystone is a very pertinent example, had no tests in Havana, Keystone version 2, because there were no tests, there were no required capabilities for it. Capabilities are only derived from tests. Since there are no capabilities, designated sections in Keystone, while useful, wouldn't be enforced because Keystone itself is not a required capability for Havana. I know that seems a little silly. Keystone is required because you can't operate OpenStack without Keystone, but we can't test whether somebody has implemented it or not without the tests to select from. So this is part of priming the pump and actually making all this stuff work. DefCore is not building tests. We're not a technical body. We use the tests in the community, and we hope that this process incents community members and vendors to fund test development to make sure that we have adequate coverage in areas that they think are important. I am certain I missed something. Oh, designated sections. Okay. So the topic for the day is selection of designated sections for that code. And there's this has been going on for quite some time. I use the analogy of your baby is ugly to help I don't want to use the word crystallize, but to help people understand what we're trying to do. It goes back to the joke, all babies are ugly. And really DefCore's goal is not to pick important code or not important code. We really believe that OpenStack as a body is all important. Different code, different parts of their life cycle. And so from that perspective, DefCore's job is to find the interoperable, stable, mature parts of the code that the community can count on being there, implementation to implementation to implementation. It's the required minimum feature set. And so from that perspective, DefCore is looking for adults in this case, and not places where we're expecting a lot of churn or replacements and things like that. And so this has been going on for quite a while. Since I think February or earlier, we've been talking about designated sections. We've been working with the TC. The TC had designed and certified 7 principles by which designated code would be made, technical decisions would be made about whether code should be designated or not. And it's incredibly logical, right? It's things that actually drive the REST or common implementations or cross-platform operations. And things that aren't designated are things that are vendor-specific being deprecated, it's if it's designed to be replaceable like the Nova Scheduler, or if it's an API extension, all pretty straightforward. When the DefCore committee took on that work, we're not a technical body. The board is not a technical body. And so we did not feel that we could make technical decisions or should make technical decisions. We're working to support the vendor ecosystem. And so we added 3 additional components into the designated sections. The first one is that code is not designated by default. So when new code shows up in the project, it is not designated. This goes back to the babies. If code is going to be designated, it becomes a decision, a positive decision that we make. That helps people be aware of change, and it promotes this concept of small core. Designated by consensus is one that we've been having discussions about. Since we're not in a position to make a technical decision, we have to be able to listen to a variety of voices and see what's going on. By and large, components of code that everybody agrees should be designated, they just agree that it should be designated. Where there's discussion and contention, the DefCore's process says, we'll listen to that contention for a while, but if it doesn't resolve itself, we have to make a decision. Our decision is not designating the code because there's disagreement. Once again, we're not making a decision for life. We're making a decision on a per-release basis. So actions in today's discussion are really limited to Havana, and it's very likely, it's actually exciting to watch, the projects mature and change, and additional code could be designated, or in some cases less code could be designated, depending on how time progresses. And we have the benefit of a time machine in this case because we have 2 releases effectively done after the Havana state. And then the final is that it's designated as guidance. We're not trying to designate, we're not creating a code police state. It's an Apache licensed project. People actually have a lot of freedom with it. Vendors have a lot of freedom with the project. Our goal is to encourage upstreaming and to provide information. Right? We want OpenStack to be interoperable. We want people to use OpenStack code, but we don't want to say you have to include this module and this library and this Python class in order to be considered OpenStack. We're trying to make the guidance much more rational from a use perspective, and not try and put microscopes into everybody's development labs. All right, with that, I've gone a little bit longer than I usually do. I think I'm trying to address points that came up in yesterday's conversation proactively. I'll pause for questions and discussion. Okay. Sean, I know you're in and you've been in. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just about to say something. Just trying to get myself off mute. So none of this is a big surprise. I was mostly joining just to, just to join. I've been keeping track of the emails. It seems like things are as on track as I would expect them to be, and seems like we're trucking along. So it's all good.
Yeah.
Nothing surprising.
Mark and Doug, you've been in quite a bit of this from the TC side. Do you have anything to add or commentary?
No, I don't think so for me. None for me.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah. Cool. All right, so with that, I'm going to dive into the designated sections. And what we did yesterday that I think proved effective was we went in the reverse order that we tried to do with the TC when we discussed it before. And we started with sort of the less contentious discussions, and we moved forward from there. So I'll try and stick to this order pretty much. And right now I'm going from these very straightforward, simple statements. We sort of wanted to make it easy to digest. We didn't want people to have to dive into the details. However, there has been a considerable amount of details. This file has, in variations, has been building for almost a year. since we started it. And so for Neutron, Havana Neutron, there are currently no designated sections. In part, Neutron is not part of core, so it doesn't take much discussion on it. This is one of those places where I would love to see us document what those designated sections are, so that they can be part of the community discussion, even if they're not. Document what the sections are, and potentially even identify designated sections, even if it's not an enforceable piece. I think it helps us prime the pump for the discussion. One of the things that we spent a lot of time in conversation about last night, in the first rendition of this meeting, was building that documentation so that technical justification of why this is a section and if it should be included or not can be had. We're still working through getting this into Garrett so we can collect more comprehensive data. Etherpads are not particularly good historical documents. So that's Neutron. Heat is in exactly the same category. It's not a core capability, so we haven't taken the time to create sections for it. Horizon's the same also. And so those three projects are fairly straightforward. And we don't have any sections defined. I would love to see community members step forward and try and define those sections. We are working with the PTLs to get their input on these sections and which ones they think should be designated or not. The next one is Keystone. Keystone has no required capabilities because the V2 was the only API that was mature enough for us to classify, and there were no tests. And from that perspective, we haven't built designated sections for it. I would love to see some designated sections. I also know that even if it had required capabilities, we would be challenged to make Keystone have designated code because there are existing OpenStack implementations that major ones that don't use Keystone, and there's a significant community consensus that Havana Keystone is not suitable for certain scale deployments. There's concerns about the implementation. I believe those are being addressed in post-Havana releases, and so we will certainly be revisiting this as we go. I also know that tests are showing up for Keystone so that we can include tests in the next iteration. Now I'll pause for conversation or discussion. Excellent. So, this is one of the challenges to me with this process, especially bootstrapping it, is getting the information in place and getting tests in place where there weren't. We certainly didn't have a chance to tell people before Havana, hey, wait, you need to write tests or your code can't be considered part of the core definition. Whether you want that or not is a different discussion. And so I think we've been giving the message very consistently since Hong Kong, certainly was heard in Atlanta. Tests and writing tests become a core commercial metric. And I can't think of a better message for OpenStack than that, frankly. All right, Cinder is the next. In Cinder, the designated section here is that the API implementation code is designated. So in this case, there's a fair number of intended replaceable sections. There's an API layer that is pretty clearly understood to be the API layer and a required component. Once again, I know that there was significant enhancements in Cinder in Icehouse and Juno, and we'll continue to revisit this as we go in the future. Discussion on Cinder. Excellent.
Not for me.
Okay. Nova. Nova's an interesting case in this one because we ultimately took the opposite approach from the other projects. In Nova, the position is that all of the code is designated with exceptions. This is closer to when we were originally engaging with the TC. The TC was more in line with all code except, and we kept that designation with Nova. We felt like that was appropriate because there were very clearly not designated sections. So the scheduler driver, filter scheduler, compute driver, REST API extensions, and Nova networking all fall very cleanly into the not designated bucket. And we haven't usually had much discussion or contention around that. That seems to be fairly straightforward. I would be interested at some point to see and compare some of the concepts that Sean's been promoting against this, because I know that there's an interesting bit of overlap in how these concepts are working, and it's nice to actually see some community consensus around this, even if the approaches are slightly different. All right. So that takes us through all of the sections except for Swift. I would pause because usually Swift turns into a larger conversation, it ends up being the contentious one, which we've always known it's been contentious since we started this process. But I would pause to make sure everybody's on board with where we are so far in the process.
Good for me.
Same here.
Excellent. Okay. It's important because if, obviously Swift is going to dig up some questions and it leads people back to some of the principles that we've been discussing. So far, I feel like in everything else, people have accepted that the principles and the way we've applied them have created reasonable results. So Swift, a little bit trickier. The ultimate position that DefCore has taken for Swift is that in Havana, there is not a community consensus over how much of the code should be designated. There are multiple vendors and parties who felt that they could use the Swift APIs and pass the compatibility tests. However, they didn't want to use the implementation of Swift as it was in Havana to provide those capabilities. And for that reason, we had multiple parties speak up about that. We've also had parties on the other side, specifically the Swift PTL, say, no, I think it's 100%. You need to have these pieces in. Because of that level of disagreement about the implementation, we fall back to our principles and say, we can't make a technical decision about this. It would not be a designated, all of Swift would not be a designated section. So in conversation yesterday, we had a request, and I think it's perfectly reasonable, for additional clarity on what the sections are. John Dixon has provided sections for us to discuss, so we actually have some basis to go through and discuss that, and then we haven't yet gone back through to the people who felt that Swift didn't have any designated sections to get their feedback and have a dialogue around that. It's the nature of the process. It takes time. I'm going to stop talking and open it up for discussion on these points.
No surprise to me. So on any count. So I don't have anything to add other than the process seems to be working. Understand the contention. We're gonna have to work it out as a community. It's not up to us to decide. Me or you specifically.
And that's
one individual.
People expect. I don't really have an opinion on this. I listen to a lot of people, and I hear the discussion, and I try to remove myself from the technical and the political, and try and go back to what our principles are for this. And so, yeah, it is what it is in that sense. I have heard people say, once again, I'm not the technical expert, but the people who said that they had concerns about Havana Swift with designated sections thought that in Juno they could actually use, there could be designated sections around the proxy layer, the object manager, the middleware pieces, and that those could actually be, that they would happily include those in their product. I'm relaying that. I'm not committing it, obviously, because I'm not the person making those technical claims. But.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm not surprised. So, but it's like you said, we have to fall back on the principles.
Okay. There is a component around Swift that I would open if we don't have more discussion around the designated sections. Oh, and there is something to show. So along those lines, I would encourage discussion not just about Swift, but around anything. We're working. So I have the designated sections JSON file in which this information, basically the same information I just presented, is encapsulated in JSON. I actually did the mapping was better than I was expecting. So we were able to capture the sections and now engage in a dialogue about designated sections per project in a much more moderated way. Once this first pass gets in, we'll be able to take patches against it. And so I would encourage people, this isn't the only bite at the apple by any stretch. We're expecting board action on this next Thursday, but once again, Havana's advisory. Icehouse is going to be the official one. We're using this to prime the pump, and so we should be able to start having conversations around Icehouse almost immediately. Would be my expectation, and start driving those things forward. So this is the file for designated sections. This pull had a minor change to the core set also, and here it is. No, I'm clicking the wrong thing. Anyway, there's also a JSON around what the core capabilities are and how those are used. All right, I'm about to switch topics, but I don't want to move off of this one until we've gone further. And I know from the attendance, most of the people that have been talking on the call have already seen this and heard it. If this is new to you and it makes sense or doesn't make sense, please, this is the ideal time to speak up, although we'll take comments any which way you want to give them. Carrier pigeon, I have a carrier pigeon stop out front for this exact situation. Excellent. What I would do is, if we're okay with the designated sections and the recommendations and don't want to have further discussion over this, I would suggest that we should talk through an item that has been brought up since we did the recommendation, one of these pages. Since we had the Havana release recommendations, I've had actually a fair number of people come to me and say that they weren't certain that Object Store should be included in the core capabilities. And so I'm happy to have that discussion now since we have a little bit of time for it. I've had enough people. I've had 5 or 6 different people representing 5 or 6 different entities come up and say to me in public forums and private that they felt that Swift capabilities were not required from a minimal set. And they were actually by companies that were shipping Swift as part of their products. They felt that their customer feedback was that they didn't always want Swift, even if it was an option. And for that reason, they felt that we had misscored the tools and clients values for Swift, and that would move it down out of the required capabilities. People have a concern or feeling about that, positive or negative. If people agree with that, I'd love to hear it. If people disagree with that, please raise that.
Hey, Rob, this is Doug.
Hey, Doug.
I think I would feel a lot more comfortable with us leaving Swift out from a core perspective, from a DefCore sort of designated sections perspective, if we also left out the capabilities, because we have very carefully tried to build the community around delivering code and not delivering API specifications. And I think if we say that we want the capabilities but we don't want the code, then we're going back on that original tenet of the community.
Are you okay with designated sections in general? So if Swift had designated sections that we could agree to, then you would say, yes, the capabilities made sense?
I think I have not heard any technical reasons for leaving out designated sections from Swift so far. It's all been about vendors and deployments and things that are not about the code itself, which I think John has made the case that there are ways you can plug things into Swift and provides a different layer of abstraction maybe than what people want, but it is there. And so if we had some sections of Swift that were not included, I might be more comfortable with that. I do still kind of feel like we ought to be encouraging vendors to contribute their drivers and things. So I'm not entirely comfortable with us saying that the driver layer is the layer where we want to allow plugins to happen outside of our tree. But realistically, I think that's not a thing we can completely control. So go ahead. There's two things I'd like to address them separately. Sure.
One is the people who are objecting to Swift are making technical objections, and we do need to stage a single topic discussion around that, get padded gloves, and let that discussion happen.
Sure. Okay.
I do fully agree with you. So I know John's very passionate about this. It's not just Swift Ceph, is Swift and React and Swift. I've heard it. They do want to be able to use that sections of that code. So we need to let that discussion happen. I do agree with you. I actually strongly agree with your premise, which is why I wanted to follow up, that it might be that we don't want required capabilities that don't have at least some designated sections. There currently is not any guidance that you should have your drivers upstreamed or not upstreamed in this. It's an interesting added piece, and I think that it might be a good discussion.
Yeah, sorry. The premise that there are sections of the code that are not required sort of implies that there's a layer that is okay for you to not deliver. I mean, that's the whole notion, right? It doesn't imply it. That's what that's saying. And so a natural point where that comes up is drivers. And I would hate, for example, for big company A to not deliver the drivers for working with some piece of equipment from big company B that is their competitor, if big company A had their own distribution. So I don't know.
I could argue exactly the same point, that if I was, let's say I'll do small company A or small company C. Let's reserve the letters. Small company C was shipping a appliance product where they had certified the whole stack, and they said this is our certified OpenStack, and they were required to ship the VMware driver, and the customer went, and the company didn't say that worked, and the company tried to turn that on and expected it to work. The company C, would be like, we'd rather remove that. It's running with scissors.
Sure, that's a legitimate argument, and I haven't completely come down on the side that you have to deliver everything, but I'm more comfortable saying that about drivers because that's sort of a natural plug-in point. But I'm not completely convinced one way or the other that it's a good idea. There's pros and cons. But
Ed, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say I typically go for free market competition on that answer, sort of to answer your meta question here, which is if customers of OpenStack, right, the real users and purchasers, find people who are putting money in the ecosystem, find that they want the whole product, right, then they will do that. And we have we have vendors who offer the integrated release as their product, and they're like, they think this is sort of silly. It's just we just ship all the code. And we have vendors who offer much more constrained versions of OpenStack who don't want to be forced to include. And my preference would be to let the market choose winners and losers rather than the board or the technical committee.
Sure. Yeah, and like I said, I see both sides of that. What is more troubling, though, is the idea that what's happening with Swift, where it seems like we want to say you have to provide object storage, but you can provide any old object storage as long as it talks to this API. And that's a level. So I was trying to get at, there are some levels where I'm really not comfortable, and there are some levels where I just think it's fundamentally wrong to make a division there. And I think that is one of the levels. If there's zero code, then that should imply that capability is not required because we don't deliver API specifications. We're actually pretty bad at specifying what our APIs are. So I'm not sure that we want to start making claims or asserting things based on those definitions.
I really like your position. I agree with it, and I think that it represents a consensus view. Okay, so that's news to me because the last time we had this conversation, there was still quite a lot of interest in having the APIs included, the capabilities included. I understand, and one of the things that's been happening as we've said, yes, the APIs are included, people have been surfacing who didn't surface before to say, wait a second, no, I'm not so sure. That makes sense. So, so, go ahead, somebody else is talking.
Yeah, no, that's John. I'd say actually that's a point where I want to jump in. I think we've exhausted like a lot of the really interested, technically oriented people that are already part of OpenStack, and these are all excellent discussions, but we're having them with the wrong people at this point because I definitely want our input to go into the people that really care about this stuff, the people that really care about the OpenStack mark and the results of these tests, and for effectively what will happen, whether we like it or not. Once the tests go in and they become mandatory for the mark, then in a certain manner of speaking, they are standards because the people at the companies that are working in product management that are in large part directing the developers are going to really want them to make sure that they carry that mark. So, and I don't think that we've really hit those people up effectively yet. And we should I think we should do it as soon as possible because I think we're ready now. So I don't know if you remember, Rob, I was part of our discussion around the line management stuff and, the hidden influencers was I brought the idea of copying what we've done with the operators group, which is effectively a subgroup of the user committee, and creating one for line management and product people. I think we should do that now and have this as the first topic because I talked to a few people at VMware and they had no clue this is going on and they were like freaked. Their eyes got big. So, and they're the ones that are really going to be, this is their job to a certain extent. Right. And it's a large part. Carrying that OpenStack brand is going to be really critical for them. And if there's things that affect that, they really need to be involved in this discussion. They're very least informed. And I just don't think they are at this point.
I agree with you, and I do. And this is to me, this process is a bit of an iceberg from that perspective. It's people, look at it, it's lost in the noise, and they don't see the broader impacts to their product shipping.
Yeah. So
go ahead, Rocky.
I'm going to reach out to Tom. I think that's probably the right person to start with, Fightful, and ask him to, or coordinate with him at least to start up what I'm thinking of calling it like the decision makers group. I don't know, something cool like that.
It's better than hidden influencers. I will give you that.
Yeah, and and we, through your contacts, Rob, and mine, and a few others, I'm sure we could pull together probably 20 people from different companies that would fit this kind of bill and just do exactly what we're doing today, or you're doing today. I'm listening, and just tell them what the heck's going on and how we think it affects them, and start eliciting their feedback for how horrible or how awesome this is.
Definitely. You're definitely right. The board is also communicating this to the people in the marketplace, and so the board is using the trademark compliance to get the attention of the people who are asking for this. And they're I'm not in those meetings, but they're supposed to be going through and explaining the coming change. Personally, I think that until the board has said this is what Havana will look like, everybody's just sort of snoozing through it, not too worried. Once we actually have an artifact, like Doug, this is literally what's been happening, right? You have an artifact and people say, "Hey, wait a second, I have an opinion of," and that's fine. That's why we're doing it this way.
I think.
Rocky?
Go ahead, Rocky.
I was just going to say that with what I'm hearing this morning, that it's going to be critical to really advertise and have a session in the trademark, legal, whatever part of the summit that goes into this sort of detail and let everybody, and I think we, like Rob said, we really need to have the Havana artifacts defined and approved by the board. I hate to say it, whether they're right or wrong, but until it's got the board approval and then we go to the summit and socialize it amongst those marketing and other people who are on the money side of these companies, we won't be able to actually get the decisions for what we need to do for Icehouse and going forward. So it's going to be critical that there's a summit session for exactly those sections that, was it John was saying, that people don't know about, to get all of the DefCore stuff out there and socialized amongst those folks who don't watch this on a day-to-day basis and don't check in code or run the code that
Right.
still have decisions to make.
I think much like the operators group, it's really critical to have those public meetings at the summit. But I think very similar to the operators group, there's a subset of the people that show up to the operators mid-cycle summits that we've held two now. There's a small subset of the people actually go to the summit from those groups. So,
right.
I think we need to do all these things. They're all components of getting the message out there. Because just for the summit itself, that even though there are a lot more marketers and a lot more product people that show up, they're still, for the most part, the initiated. They're the ones that have already been convinced, already know what's going on, mostly. There are newbies that keep showing up, but a very small percentage of the actual number of people that really need to be involved. So I think we just need to aggressively do outreach and dig into the companies at VMware and HP and all the rest, Dell and everyone, and try to pull those people out so that the way that I was thinking of it is a good analogy is when we're doing stuff on the board, it's much like making a law in Congress, United States Federal Congress, and we think we're doing it with all the right information, and we've done our due diligence, we've debated it for months, and we've come up with a law, and then the law goes out there and it gets a little bit more debated, mostly on the political talk shows. But when it really hits home and when people really find out and understand the law is when it goes into effect and people start coming on either side of that law. And that's we want to try to avoid that as much as possible, where suddenly people start popping out of the woodwork saying, "What do you mean I can't use the brand?"
Right. And that's one of the reasons why I don't want us to not have the harder conversations, right? I mean, I think that this whole discussion around Swift has been an important test and gotten people's attention about what we're doing. I think that we're getting to a consensus point where Swift APIs shouldn't be part of core. It sort of addresses, Doug, I agree with your point. I think it addresses your point, although it also just has people say, oh, I don't have to worry about that now, and they don't actually have the discussion that you're really driving, which is around specification of the APIs and API versus implementation and things like that that are really important conversations to have. And so, we're successful in some cases, Sean, to your point, that the controversies create awareness. I certainly don't want to manufacture controversy. I think that's horrible. However, I think that the dialogue and the discussions, especially when they're heated, do get, as long as they don't get silly, do help people pay attention to the issues and start seeing what's going on. Right. And I think that's true of a lot of the things that the board, that comes to the board's attention, even like the DCO versus CLA conversations that there's a meta level of that's very important, even if we're down at the details.
I would love to actually see a panel, whether it's at the summit or elsewhere, but recorded, of some of these folks that Sean is talking about, the product managers, the VPs and whatnot, a panel discussing DefCore and the whole concept of API specifications versus API code and other code. And you
should have voted. You should have helped me vote for the one. We had one.
I voted.
I'm teasing. We need a block vote. Don't even get me started on that.
Maybe we could use one of the pod rooms during Monday or something, and have an impromptu WW
knockdown fight.
Yeah, exactly. And have people wear the masks and the tights and everything.
And actually, that is one of the points that I think, Doug, when you were surprised that I said that's the consensus view, that we still have two significant fringes in the community that we're trying to balance against. There's a lot of people who want OpenStack to be an API-driven spec and an API-driven project, and allow people to use OpenStack without the code. And there are a significant body of people who believe that the OpenStack is the code, and the API is just an artifact of that. And so DefCore has literally always been that balancing between those two interests.
Yeah, it's like I said, I was pleasantly surprised to hear that there's some consensus coming closer to what I would like to see. So the fact that there are the all in or all out groups that's no surprise. But I think the middle, there's some place in the middle that will make enough people happy. And I think that the real thing that we need to be careful of is making sure that the actual project contributors are having their voice heard. And it sounds like that's happening. So that is also good for me.
Good. I can't think of a better comment to close on. Thank you. Everybody, I appreciate you taking an hour out to participate. Exciting dialogue. I think we really covered some important topics with this, and I really appreciate everybody's participation.
Thank you for doing this, Rob. Have a great day.
You too.